Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Chee-Tash. My name is Chris, and today we have the final episode covering Chapter 9 of The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck. Last chapter of the book titled, And Then You Die. If you guys remember last time talking about Chapter 8, that was the importance of saying no. A couple of the highlights from this chapter. I had mentioned how this chapter reminded me a lot of the book The One Thing, where when you have your one thing, you're better able to say no to a lot of other different things. Because when you're just focused on like a singular or just like a couple different things, you feel like you don't have to say yes to everything that comes your way. And you just know day in and day out what you have to do, what you are focused on, that other things are trivial. Other things don't need to be done. In addition to that, I really liked how in the previous chapter he talked about relationships. And in relationships, you have to be willing to accept and give rejection. And how it is all about setting up boundaries. And boundaries meaning that you have your issues that you deal with, and they have their issues that they deal with in a relationship. And you're both trying to figure them out in your own way. You're both trying to figure out how to solve your own issues, and you're not cross-pollinating between each other. So which means, hey, I entirely ignore my issues, so I'm going to go out and help my girlfriend with her issues. Mark says that's not like the healthiest way to have a relationship. It's by setting up those boundaries between the things that you're dealing with and the things that the other person is dealing with. And yes, still helping out each other where you need it, but ultimately you are responsible for your own issues that you are having. The other person isn't. So I thought that was a pretty cool chapter. And today we talk about the last chapter, and then you die, because ultimately we all meet the same fate. And I know what maybe some smart people out there will say, oh, well, there are people out there who are researching longevity, researching how to stay alive forever. I've heard of some people having transfusions of new, younger blood. Potentially, maybe that helps. Downloading your consciousness so you live forever. Okay, I get it. I get that. Okay, but ultimately, some things just come to an end. How about that? Some things just come to an end. And I think the mentality of not giving a fuck, which is what this book is about, that mentality ultimately stems from realizing your death and realizing that, you only have a certain amount of time, and that you really just want to care about the things you should be caring about. That's really, and to put it simply, and this is kind of what Mark talks about in this chapter, is death gives life meaning. So Mark talks about, in this very beginning section, this story that he had, and I'm going to paraphrase this story because it was a log anecdote, where he's at this party in Dallas. He's got his friend Josh, and I guess they're pretty good friends. And his friend Josh is thinking about climbing up this cliff and jumping into the lake. And they kind of go their separate ways that night. And ultimately, Mark doesn't realize it, but Josh ends up dying from jumping into the lake, because apparently it was at night. Josh was pretty drunk as well. I think that had a lot to do with it. But Josh says something to Mark that kind of stands out in the story as Mark and him are going their separate ways in the night. And Josh tells Mark, "Seek the truth and I will meet you there." And I thought that's a really powerful quote, because ultimately truth should be something that's probably universal, right? And I mean, yeah, I guess people have their biases and there's different interpretations of things, but ultimately, like, absolute truths are universal. And if there are meeting places of where these ideas exist, then people are going to tend to congregate in a singular location where the truth is, because it's not maybe up to interpretation. This is the spot where it is. This is true. So I will meet you there. So I thought that was a really cool quote. But Mark goes on to say kind of something that I was saying earlier. Death scares us all. And we tend to avoid thinking about it, but the fact of the matter is that without death, everything just seems inconsequential. So a big part of this chapter is talking about this guy, Ernest Becker, who is a PhD in anthropology, and he writes a book called The Denial of Death. And Ernest Becker's got a very interesting background story. He bounces around from university to university. He has trouble holding down a job. And ultimately, he ends up getting diagnosed with colon cancer. He doesn't have that long to live. So at this point is when he writes this book. Becker dies in 1974. And then the book, it's probably published maybe right around then. Book one goes on to become one of the most influential works of the 20th century. It actually wins a Pulitzer Prize. And Mark talks about two main points from the book here. So the first point is that humans think about ourselves abstractly, and we are pretty much maybe one of the few animals to do it. And I know there's very highly intelligent animals out there like dolphins, whales, elephants, etc., crows and ravens, chimpanzees, the great apes. Yes, okay, but I think humans are the only ones that we can prove that conceptualize ourselves abstractly, in that we can think about ourselves outside ourselves. We can think about things like the future. We can imagine a reality without ourselves in it. And we can start to extrapolate things from that, extrapolate things from outside of ourselves. Like, if I wasn't here, who would be living in this house? How would my family react to that? How would my family grow up? How would my brothers and sisters, grow up without an older brother if I had never existed? It's kind of like from A Christmas Carol, where at one point in the story, doesn't Ebenezer Scrooge imagines a life where he never existed, and like what happens to the people surrounding him and stuff. So as humans, we're blessed with the ability to imagine ourselves in hypothetical situations, to contemplate both the past and the present, and to imagine other realities. So the realization that life could go on without you, or what life could be without you, there is what Becker calls death terror. And it's something that he says underlies everything that we think or do. Second point is that we have two selves, Becker talks about in the book. So we have a physical self and a conceptual self. So the physical self is the one that moves around in the world all day, every day, eats, sleeps, walks, works at their job, etc., etc. It's your, I guess, the physical body. And then the conceptual self is your identity, or how you see yourself. So what Becker states is that we try to construct a conceptual self, so an abstraction of ourselves, or how we view ourselves, an identity, in order to then have that identity live beyond death and survive the physical self. The physical self is going to ultimately come to an end, but you have a chance to have the conceptual self live on beyond that. And we do this in a variety of ways. Maybe He talks about some examples in the book. That's why you see people donating money to get their money, or not their money, donate money to get their names attached to like a certain charity or a scholarship or a building, a football stadium. University of Alabama's football stadium is called, I believe it's called Bryant-Denny Stadium. Paul Bear Bryant. I'm not familiar with who Denny is, but yeah, stadiums are named after people. Jordan Hare Stadium, T. Boone or Bobby Bowden Field, just as some examples. So these are examples of your conceptual self going above and beyond to live past your physical self, because the conceptual self will stay there in the name of a building or in your kids or the work you do, maybe the videos you make, etc. Becker calls these immortality projects. So they're ways that we are trying to survive beyond the physical self. And Becker states that the meaning in life comes from never wanting to truly die. And you generate the meaning in your life by working on this conceptual self. Mark goes on, and maybe I have this on the next slide. Yeah, okay. So Mark goes on and says, if you haven't figured it out yet, our immortality projects are our values. They are the barometers of meaning and worth in our life. And when our values fail, so do we, psychologically speaking. And Becker, I forget if this was Becker or Mark talking about this, but the problems arise when you no longer believe the conceptual self will outlive the physical. This is where you start to get depression, anxiety. You start to lash out. You start to think that, oh my gosh, there is no meaning, so it doesn't even matter what I do, and things can get pretty destructive when you no longer work on this conceptual self, when you no longer are working on these immortality projects or working on your values or living by your values. And like I said earlier, we care about too much in this world. And I remember having this conversation with ways. I don't think I would, to be clear. I don't think I would. But in some ways, I see the simplicity of it in that you're only really worried about just a couple things. Whereas now, with everything seemingly, a lot of things taken care of, you can then worry about these little trivial things. But ultimately, you shouldn't be caring about those little teensy-wincy things. But you can care about them because everything else is just taken care of. And I think maybe that's the epidemic that we are in today, is just people don't know what to care about anymore. So maybe they care too much about death. But the thing is, we can't control that. I mean, I guess we can, maybe a little bit if you stay healthy and such, but ultimately it comes for all of us. So Becker kind of states here, well, why are you caring about this end when you can be building up that conceptual self to live beyond when the physical self comes to an end? And then the bitter antidote. I think the bitter antidote, let me see if I can find that part. Becker called this the bitter antidote. The bitter antidote, Becker states, because he later came to a startling realization on his deathbed that people's immortality projects were actually the problem, not the solution. That rather than attempting to implement, often through lethal force, their conceptual self across the world, people should question their conceptual self and become more comfortable with the reality of their own death. Becker calls this the bitter antidote. Okay, so the bitter antidote is just getting comfortable with the fact that there is no antidote, basically. There is no escaping this. And I see what he's saying there with the conceptual self being the problem. It's not the solution, because as Mark stated earlier in the book, if you guys remember, the example we used was the homeless person on the street and Warren Buffett both have problems. It's just that Warren Buffett's problems are better problems to have, seemingly. But as you progress in life, you're just trading your old problems with new problems. And I think maybe that's what Becker means here by working at your conceptual self is not to get at a solution, but for you to create more problems for yourself to solve. And it's like a never-ending puzzle. And I think that's what Becker means by this bitter antidote is that, hey, the struggle never ends and you're not going to escape this thing that ultimately happens to all of us. So you might as well just keep working at your values, keep working on those immortality projects, not for you to completely finish them one day, but just for you to be satisfied in your day-to-day life that you have something to work on. And I believe this was my last slide. And in this last part of the book, Mark goes on another anecdote where I think he was in South Africa at the Cape of Bighorn. I think that's the tip. And he kind of talks about him, just being inches away off this cliff, looking across the ocean. Somebody comes up there with him and says, "Hey, are you doing okay?" He's just checking up on him. And Mark says, "I've never felt so alive." Being just inches away from death. And it's funny how being inches away like that really causes somebody to wake up. And as Mark states here in the first bullet point that I have there, nothing makes you more present than being inches away from death. A man who lives fully is prepared to die at any time. I think that was a Mark Twain. I think that was a Mark Twain quote, if I remember correctly. Let me see if I can find it really quick. Yeah, the fear of death follows from the fear of life. A man who lives fully is prepared to die at any time. That was Mark Twain. So by you confronting this reality that we all face, Mark says that it obliterates the crappy, fragile, superficial values. You don't have time for those anymore. Think of good values to live by, good immortality projects to build, and from there, you have a chance to go beyond the physical self. But if you don't respect the fact that this reality comes for all of us, that death comes for all of us, then you're probably going to maybe live by crappy values because then you don't really care. You're not focused on certain things. You're just going to do things willy-nilly, and maybe you're going to burn out fast. You're going to, live fast, die young, maybe mentality there. But ultimately, the conceptual self is seeing yourself as bigger than yourself, bigger than the physical self. And I thought this was a great last bullet point here that Mark states that in today's world, and this kind of gets to what I was saying earlier, in today's world, we're materially well off, but yet we're psychologically tormented because not everything, but a lot of things are just taken care for us. We can order food from an app and have it delivered. We don't have to go out anywhere. We can date from our phones. We don't have to go out anywhere. We can work from home. We can hire people to come in and clean your house. All of these things I have done. But without the struggles, what are we left caring about? We're left caring about, am I gaining weight? Oh, what does this person think of me? Oh my gosh, I don't have the latest and greatest tech from Sony. I don't have the latest and greatest iPhone. Little things like that. Probably not the greatest. And with that brings us to the end of the book, The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck. Thank you guys very much for listening. I hope you guys really like this series. This is a good book. Like I said, I read it once years ago, and then I was gifted it for my birthday last year. So I thought it would be really cool to reread it for the channel. Hope you guys got a lot out of this. And thank you guys just so much for supporting and listening. I've got some interesting ideas that I'm trying to implement. I got to think about a next book to read. So I might take like a couple weeks off. The interviews are just rolling in. I got to catch up on those, and I have a lot in the backlog saved up. So I got to start getting those out and start scheduling some new interviews with some other great guests coming up. So just, yeah, thank you guys very much for listening. Stay tuned. Big things coming. My name is Chris. This has been Chee-Tash. Take care, everybody.